At 3:15 in the afternoon of December 30th, 1903, a stagehand named William McMullen saw a small flame on the edge of a muslin drape above the Iroquois theater stage in Chicago. He stepped forward with a stage cloth to smother it. The cloth caught. 27 minutes later, 602 people were dead. The theater had advertised itself since opening night with 3 words printed on the inside cover of every program: absolutely fireproof. The designation, as a matter of definitions, was technically accurate. The Iroquois did not burn down. The structure survived. The people inside it did not. This is the story of the gap between 2 meanings of one word. And the document, signed 5 weeks before the fire, that had already described what the disaster would later prove. 5 weeks before the fire, the Iroquois had already failed its safety inspection. Not informally, not by rumor, on paper, in writing, with a signature at the bottom. Chicago in the autumn of 1903 was a city building theaters. Downtown attendance had doubled in 5 years. Benjamin Marshall, the architect of the Iroquois, was on his first major commission. The Iroquois was meant to be his proof. 1,200 seats in the orchestra, 600 in the balcony. A stage wide enough for the spectacle productions that were filling the biggest houses in New York. He designed it quickly and built it faster. The Iroquois opened on schedule. In the theater business of 1903, that fact alone was considered a kind of success. Among the staff that opening week was a stage manager named Roy Cummings. The Iroquois had been booked for a holiday spectacular called Mr. Bluebeard. The production required several tons of painted muslin scenery suspended above the stage on a steel framework called the gridiron. The gridiron sat high above the performing area, densely packed with scenery, lighting rigs, and the pulleys that moved the sets between scenes. Running vertically through the stage structure, directly above it, was a standpipe, the vertical water pipe that should feed emergency hoses if the gridiron caught fire. During rehearsals that opening week, Roy Cummings asked management a specific question: whether the standpipe had been completed and connected to a water source. The answer he received as he recorded it in his coroner's deposition 3 months later was that the equipment in place was sufficient. The standpipe had not been connected. Cummings wrote down what he was told. He kept doing his job. But before the management answered Cummings, before the theater opened, before the first audience sat down, a city inspector had already walked through the building and found what was missing. All of it in writing. In the second week of November 1903, a Chicago building inspector named Edward Laughlin walked through the new Iroquois Theater with a checklist. The checklist had originated from the Chicago Building Department's 1898 Theater Safety Ordinance, considered at the time it was drafted the most stringent in the country. By the time Laughlin left the building, his copy had at least 14 items marked incomplete. No exit lighting on emergency stairs, no sprinkler system in the auditorium, no fire alarm box connected to the city system, fire escape openings cut into the north wall, openings that led not to fire escapes, but to a 30-foot drop into the alley below, and smoke vents above the stage, specified in the original construction documents that had not been installed. Each item was a separate cited violation. Each item was signed off as a deferred condition, to be corrected in the weeks following the opening. The waiver was signed by Laughlin and countersigned by Will J. Davis, the theater's manager. The Iroquois opened on November 23rd. 37 days later, with most of the 14 items still incomplete, the building killed 602 people. What the record shows is this: the permit system that produced Laughlin's waiver produced hundreds like it every season. Deadline pressure, management assurances, an opening date already announced in the papers, a checklist process that had a formal slot for deferred conditions. The record does not need a bribe to explain what happened. The legal process itself was enough. The Iroquois waiver was unusual only in what it cost. The warning had a date. The date is what makes everything that follows so hard to read. One item the waiver did not name was the asbestos curtain. It had been specified in the original construction documents as a solid asbestos device, built to drop in 15 seconds and seal the stage from the auditorium in the event of a fire. Laughlin had no reason to inspect it. It was a stage fixture, not a building element in the code's meaning. The question of what it was actually made of would not appear on any record until February of 1904, when the coroner's chemist analyzed what was left of it. The answer, when it came, would not match the advertisement. Roy Cummings raised the standpipe question again during opening week. His question, as he recorded it in his deposition, was direct. What happens if any of this catches? The answer he received was that the asbestos curtain would contain it. This was the building's entire theory of safety in a sentence. Everything above the stage could burn. The code had not addressed it. The curtain would stop the fire from crossing into the auditorium. The smoke vents would pull the heat upward. The standpipe would give the stagehands a fighting chance. All three systems were either uninstalled, untested, or not what they had been advertised to be. In late November 1903, a fire safety trade journal published a review of the Iroquois' opening run. The piece noted the gap between the absolutely fireproof claim in the management's press releases and the exit configuration the writer had personally observed during the opening week. It was published 2 weeks before the fire. None of them, on the surviving record, acted on it. By the third week of December, the smoke vents above the stage had still not been installed. The standpipes had not been connected. The second pre-Christmas inspection, promised in the waiver, had not occurred. The matinee schedule was at capacity through the new year. Here is what this amounts to. The building's single advertised safety mechanism had not been verified. The backup systems behind it had not been installed. And the one person who had asked the right question had been told not to worry. Every piece of what followed was already in place. The most dangerous thing in the theater was not the first flame. It was the promise the building had made and could not keep. That promise had been measured in November to at least 14 items. It had been signed and filed. Before the exits, before the curtain, before the fire itself, there is a version of the Iroquois disaster that has circulated in popular history for over a century. 600 people, the story goes, were killed by their own crowd response. A panicked audience rushed the exits and crushed each other. That is not what the inquest record says. Hold that. By 2:30 on the afternoon of December 30th, the Iroquois Auditorium held something near 1,900 people. The Chicago Tribune's December 31st morning edition would list the first 132 identified by name. The full list of names would take 3 weeks to complete. The Chicago Tribune ran the names in installments, adding new identifications each morning through mid-January. Some of the dead were identified by clothing, not by face. At 3:15, during the second act octet of Mr. Bluebeard, an electric arc light suspended above the stage flickered. A small flame appeared on the edge of a muslin drape, 8 feet to the light's right. William McMullen stepped forward with a stage cloth. The cloth caught. The fire moved from the muslin drape into the painted scenery above the stage. Within 90 seconds, the gridiron was burning. The asbestos curtain was lowered. The curtain descended 15 feet and stopped. The bottom edge had caught on a lighting bracket that should not have been in its path. The bracket had been installed in early November, after the construction documents were finalized. The curtain now hung 8 feet above the stage floor, leaving an open passage between the burning gridiron and the auditorium. At 3:18, a rear stage door was forced open by performers escaping into the alley. Cold December air, drawn into the building by the rising heat above the stage, accelerated through the open passage beneath the stuck curtain and into the auditorium. The smoke vents above the stage, which had not been installed, would have drawn the smoke upward and away from the audience. They did not exist. The fire and smoke moved instead into the seats. On stage, still in costume as Sister Anne, Eddie Foy stepped into the smoke. He raised his hands and asked the audience to remain seated and walk calmly to the nearest exit. The Tribune's coverage on December 31st recorded that he stood on the stage for approximately 7 minutes until the falling scenery made the position untenable. Foy himself, writing 25 years later in a memoir, would describe the same 7 minutes in different language. The 1903 Tribune is the more cautious account. Most of the 1,900 people in the auditorium moved toward the exits within a minute of the smoke arriving. And this is where the popular account breaks down. The pile-up deaths at the side and rear exits were not caused by the crowd's failure to move toward the doors. They were caused by the crowd's failure to operate the doors. The exits were of 3 types. The main lobby doors opened inward toward the lobby, opening by design away from the people pressing against them. The side and rear exits used a lever pattern mechanism called a bascule lock, unfamiliar to anyone who had not been specifically instructed in its use. This was not a domestic mechanism. It was not in common use anywhere else in the city. People who had never seen it before could not figure out how to release it. The fire escape doors on the north wall opened onto an alley with no fire escape structures installed below. They were openings cut into walls that led to a 30-foot drop. The doors were, mechanically, working as designed. The design was the problem. The asbestos curtain presents a second gap between the popular account and the record. In the popular telling, the curtain failed because the fire was too hot for it. A chemical analysis filed with the coroner's inquest in February 1904 showed something different. A sample of the curtain, taken from the surviving fragments, was identified by a chemist named Carl Pfanstiehl, the coroner's appointed analyst, as a mixed compound: cotton fiber, wood pulp, and a mineral additive, Pfanstiehl named asbestine, a textile mineral substitute that is not asbestos. The curtain had been a textile counterfeit of the safety device the theater had advertised. Marshall Everett, in a popular 1904 retelling of the disaster, would attribute the curtain's failure to the heat of the fire. The chemical record disagreed. Approximately 600 people died in the auditorium and at its exits in the 27 minutes between the arc light and the moment the Chicago Fire Department declared the fire under control at 3:42 p.m. The Iroquois had been emptied by 4:30. The dead were carried out through the rear alley and laid in temporary morgues along Randolph Street. The Marshall Field storerooms on State Street, 3 blocks east, were open to receive bodies for identification. By nightfall, Mayor Carter Harrison had issued an order closing every theater, music hall, and place of public amusement in the city of Chicago. 172 venues in total. The order was unprecedented. It would be lifted, gradually and theater by theater, over the following 6 weeks. Civil suits were filed by victims' families through the early months of 1904. None of them produced substantive compensation. The Iroquois Theater Company had been structured in a way that limited its exposure. By the end of 1904, the company had been dissolved. The families who had filed civil suits were left with no solvent defendant. Roy Cummings' deposition, with the question about the standpipe, and the answer he had been given, was entered into the inquest record in January. By morning, the disaster was no longer only a fire. It was a paperwork problem. Who had signed what, who had deferred what, and whether any of it had actually been illegal. The Cook County Coroner's Inquest convened in early January 1904 and sat for 6 weeks. Its verdict, returned in February, was that the deaths had been caused by criminal carelessness. The inquest named 6 individuals as primarily responsible, including manager Will J. Davis, architect Benjamin Marshall, and Inspector Edward Laughlin. The coroner's verdict was, by statute, a recommendation. The decision to prosecute belonged to the state's attorney. The state's attorney brought charges against Davis and Laughlin in 1906. The trial in 1907 ran for several days. The jury deliberated briefly and returned a verdict of not guilty for both defendants. The legal grounds were that no specific provision of the Chicago Building Code, as it had stood in November 1903, had been violated. The waiver process itself, the defense argued, was legal. It was. The Chicago Theater Code was rewritten in 1904. The new code required exit lighting on emergency stairs, sprinkler systems in auditoriums, panic bar hardware on every exit door, and the elimination of inward opening exits in places of public assembly. The panic bar mechanism, retroactively, was named the Iroquois door in fire safety trade literature. Eddie Foy's testimony before a congressional committee in 1908 was, on the record, that the Chicago reforms had been adopted in Chicago and ignored almost everywhere else. Will J. Davis returned to theater management at smaller Chicago venues by 1909. Benjamin Marshall went on to design the Drake Hotel, the Edgewater Beach Hotel, and 60 further commissions across the next 30 years. Edward Laughlin remained at the Chicago Building Department until his retirement in 1919. The reforms were real. Their reach was not. My read of the record is this. The building was, in the meaning of its designation, fireproof. It was not, in the meaning that mattered, survivable. That distinction is the one Chicago spent the next 12 months learning to write into its building code. and the one the rest of American theater would mostly take another decade to recognize. The 14-item waiver Edward Laughlin signed in November of 1903 was not the cause of the disaster. It was a description of what the disaster would later prove. Absolutely fireproof remained on the Iroquois' surviving programs and press files. The phrase passed into Chicago history as an epitaph. It had not been written as one.